Bearded dragons are some of the most unique-looking reptiles on Earth with their spiky beards and their ability to change colors depending on their mood. But did you know there are actually two different types of bearded dragons? You have the Australian bearded dragons, and then you have the bearded dragons from the island of Est. And even though they look very similar, these two types of bearded dragons are actually completely different species. For example, Australian bearded dragons can grow up to 24 inches long, while the Spanish ones only grow to about 16 inches. The Spanish ones also have more of a triangular head shape, while the Australian ones have more of a rounded head. But aside from their physical differences, they also have different personalities. You see, it's commonly known that bearded dragons from Australia are much more docile than their Spanish counterparts. That is why the Spanish bearded dragons have earned the nickname the psycho bearded dragons, because they are known for being extremely aggressive and are not recommended for first-time reptile owners. But ever since people started breeding them together, we've started to see some interesting things happening with their behavior. In fact, there is this one bearded dragon owner who has been selectively breeding his bearded dragons for generations, trying to make the ultimate pet bearded dragon. So, today we're going to talk about all the crazy things that he has discovered about bearded dragons along the way. Theory, no. 1. Bearded dragons from Est. As I mentioned earlier, the bearded dragons from Australia and the bearded dragons from Hispaniola are two completely different species. But did you know that the bearded dragons from Hispaniola may actually be hybrids themselves? In fact, scientists believe that the bearded dragons from Est are a hybrid between the Centralian bearded dragon and the Australian bearded dragon. This could explain why they have the more triangular head shape of the Centralian bearded dragon and the color-changing abilities of the Australian bearded dragon. It could also explain why they are so aggressive, because the Centralian bearded dragon is known for being very territorial and aggressive. Theory? No. 2. You can't turn an Australian bearded dragon into a psycho bearded dragon and vice versa. This is a pretty common theory in the bearded dragon community. Some people believe that once you breed an Australian bearded dragon with a Spanish bearded dragon, you can't go back. Meaning, if you are to breed a hybrid bearded dragon with an Australian bearded dragon, the offspring would still be a hybrid and would still have the potential to be aggressive. However, this is just a theory, and there is no scientific evidence to support it. Theory? No. 3. Temperament is linked to color. Now, this is an interesting one. Have you ever noticed that your bearded dragon gets darker when it's getting angry or stressed? Well, it turns out that the color-changing ability of bearded dragons is actually linked to their temperament. In fact, the darker the coloration, the more aggressive the bearded dragon is likely to be. This is why the bearded dragons that are bred for their color often end up being extremely aggressive. It's almost like they are trying to warn you not to mess with them. Theory number 4. Size matters. Have you ever wondered why the Spanish bearded dragons are so much smaller than the Australian bearded dragons? Well, it turns out that there is a reason behind their small stature. You see, the Spanish bearded dragons are actually descended from a population of Australian bearded dragons that were captured in the wild and brought to the island of However, the Australian bearded dragons that were captured were only the smaller ones. The larger ones were left behind. This is why the Spanish bearded dragons are so much smaller than their Australian counterparts. Theory number 5. The more you handle your bearded dragon, the calmer it will be. This is a pretty common theory among bearded dragon owners, but it is not entirely true. In fact, it has been proven that the more you handle your bearded dragon, the more stressed it will become. This is because bearded dragons are prey animals and they are constantly on the lookout for predators. When you approach your bearded dragon, it thinks that you are a predator and it will become stressed. Therefore, it is important to only handle your bearded dragon when it is time for a feeding and to keep the handling sessions short. But now, it's time to hear from you. Do you have any bearded dragon theories of your own? If so, feel free to share them in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.